Hello. Hello.
Yes.
How's the sound?
You have to unmute your mic.
Hello.
Yes.
How's the sound?
Microphone.
Good, I can hear myself.
You have to unmute your mic.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, we can hear
How's
you.
the sound?
We can hear you, Mike.
Good, I can hear myself.
You have to unmute your mic.
Hello. Alright, well the music will be on later, so...
You might have an echo. So you have the stream open. Mouse over this. Yeah, mute that. Yep, there you go. Now you won't have an echo.
Okay.
Unless you have us open somewhere else.
No,
Looks good, looks good.
I turned it off.
Alright,
I turned
awesome.
off this one.
Where did I tell you that? Tell me what? My grandmother's in the hospital. Just going south really
Okay.
fast. We're talking about to back her pills and stuff. Just
Alright, you should be, just leave that open. You should be good.
Yeah.
I'm not leaving yet. I just
I
don't
do,
know
but
what's
some
going
another
on.
officer must have just happened. I might have to leave.
So anyway, hello.
I'm sure that Andrew and Mark are.
My name is Mike Crossmire. I do visual effects here at City State. And it's been a while since I've done a stream. I really have nothing planned in particular. I'm just going to kind of wing it.
Yes, say all
So
of that.
we'll see what happens.
Okay. So you're trying to you're using a basic arrow and you're trying to get it to play a siege animation? No. What, Scott? What are you even? Wait! Stop! What are you trying to do? Okay.
Unfortunately, the picture-in-picture is a little bit too big on this screen. I might turn it off anyway to save the children, so you don't have to look at me. But my hair is so incredibly fluffy.
That we're putting that tag in this skill. That's a question. Yes or no?
I'm thinking maybe I can move it down here.
Okay. What do you want? I can set
Yeah,
it up.
the microphone is fairly sensitive. I can't really adjust it. It's the Logitech webcam's microphone. But maybe you'll hear something secret in the background. Who knows? Right, Tyler?
What? No.
Okay. Crosses my
Gotcha.
Oh, so anyway, go back to this. So it's been a while since I've talked about our particle system and
Siege arrow.
what we have for visual effects.
So in my ability.
And a lot of things have changed in the past several months. A lot of great additions and new stuff.
Siege arrow. Instead of basic
So I can
arrow.
kind of go through a few
Right,
basic
and
things
all the other
here.
things.
First of all, I wanted to
Whatever.
remind people about a few certain things about the way our system works,
That should be different, right?
just in case. And then after I'm done blabbing for a bit, I'll probably actually go back to doing real work. And I've got to do some stuff for the Blackguard, or as I prefer to say, the Blackguard. Only you savages from the colonies say Blackguard. Anyway, so one thing to remember about our particle system, or our effect system, is that everything is a sprite. So,
our actual XML here. Find
for
out
instance,
exactly what's happening.
I will create
So
a new one right here.
basic arrow and siege arrow.
Oops. Just so you can see. Hopefully there's enough resolution on the stream so that you can see all the text over here. Our interface for particles is pretty much all text. So everything I enter is data in text format of some sort. So I will burst a particle and let's put it over here, x equals 6. Well, I need to move it further away. So, oops. I put it a little bit too far away.
Okay, so what we want to have happen
Not 20.
is for the siege tag.
Anyway, so this is our
What is
generic
the
1
actual
meter
tag?
particle.
Is it siege arrow or
And
is
so
it
everything in our game,
just siege? Okay.
effects-wise, is
So
going
what
to
we want
be
have happen is for
a
the
sprite
siege
image on a
arrow, we
quad
want
like
to play that
this.
tag, and for the regular arrow, we want to
And
play
I can do
that
things
tag.
like I can
For the
make
regular
it
arrow, we want to play
different sizes. It's all the typical particle kind of stuff I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So I can make it tall and
We are using
skinny,
APO.
wide and fat, etc. Like this. So any effect is just going to be a big cluster of these moving around in hopefully some interesting way, and I can tint them, and I can do a flip book on images and things like that. But
No, because okay, so
that's
the way tags
as
work,
sophisticated as
Is-
the animation
is it
gets
takes all the tags
of,
that it has.
in itself. So I can't do material animation or things like
takes
that
all the
yet.
tags that it has,
However,
and it
uh,
looks each one
maybe
up
sometime in the
all
future
the
that will
options
be
that it has or all the
available.
animations
But
that
for
it
now,
can play
that's
with and
that's what I have to work with. And for the most
And it
part, I
takes
can
one
do
point
pretty much
for
everything
each
I
add-on.
need.
So these tags
It's just a
have-
matter
like
of
I could say, like, this one has a way to
learning how
one,
to
so
use the
and
system
this
to full
one-
advantage so I can get the
Let's-
most out
let's
of
leave that
it.
aside for now and just assume everything
get
is
the
going because
desired
that's how it's actually
result.
set up. It takes
And now, since the last time
it
I was
looks up
on
each of those
a
tags,
web
adds
stream
up the
like
values
this,
for each of those tags,
I've gotten a
and
lot
puts
of
the
great new
animation behind
features,
it.
and I can
So
do
if
a
you have
lot
no
more
tags,
with the particles than
it's
I
just gonna
used
randomly
to.
pick something
For
from that
instance,
Does that make sense?
before,
It just
particles were
doesn't
doing
know. It's
exactly
like,
what
well,
they're
all of a
doing
sudden
now,
it's
where
four, I don't know
they're
which
totally
one to pick,
camera
I'm just gonna pick
facing,
one, and then
like
play
this.
that.
But now
So
I
when
can
you're
make
seeing
them
random
point
things
any
picked,
direction
that's
I
fine.
want, and I
It's
can do
just
lots of
tags to
other
inform it of what it should be picking.
great things, so I can do
What I'm
all
going to
sorts
do is I'm
of
gonna open up the siege arrow.
useful
I'm gonna give that the siege tag.
animations.
I'm gonna open up the
So,
basic
for
arrow. And
instance,
what's the tag? It's like slow,
I
standard,
can
fast, right?
do
Which of those should the basic arrow be playing? I'm
something
guessing
like this. Takes it a
it
bit
should be
to
playing all of
update.
them.
Now what I've done is I've made
How can
some
that be? Okay.
particle setups as templates so that I don't have to remember how to do all these from scratch every time. The tricky bit is that particle systems are all basically hierarchy, and each of those
So bow
deals with
attack
a
second, bow attack fast,
different
bow attack
coordinate
second. Okay.
system. So the way our system works, as a brief recap, is we have things which are spawners, and then we have particles. And they're sort of interchangeable. It's a little bit tricky to describe, but what happens is a spawner can create a particle, and then that particle itself when I put a spawner definition beneath it, can spawn its own particles. So for instance,
Yeah.
here, what I have
So
is I
when
have
we're
a
gonna play
basic
basic
kind of cone splash,
Which of those animations do you want it to play?
and I just have it kind of wink in and out. And the streaks like this, as you can see, are
So,
actually directional.
the
So
timing-
they all
Like,
face
given skill
radially
points,
outward,
right?
and they can
So when you have
form
a
this kind of
fast and
splash
slow,
effect.
Those are different speeds, right?
It's a little tricky to move the camera
But that
around.
ability is only going to play at
Like
one
this.
speed, right?
So the particles themselves don't all camera face anymore, and this is tremendously
So if the
useful.
ability plays at a
So I can not only get something like that, which is fairly
2 seconds, right? Slow is going to
uninteresting, but then I can do this where
What's
they're
fast?
flowing outward,
Okay.
or I
So-
can make it do a pulse.
I don't know what this. Well, perhaps it was.
Like this. You get your shock wave kind of effect. Could be for a splash of water. And as you can see, these particles also are animating their shape as they move over time. And so I can do things like, this is a fairly flat ring. And what they do is they point toward their spawner, which is this thing in the middle called pulse. So if I make it spawn at 1 meter off the ground instead of 0.5,
Longbow abilities are going to play for 1.6 seconds.
then they'll shift a bit more downward because each of the axes of the particles, which say P, are trying to point toward this center point
Well,
here.
so
Anyway,
abilities can affect those stats because you can have like.
let me see if I've got any other.
That's why we are doing.
I've
this
got a
test to
whole
try to
bunch of
figure all these
template
different,
files here, but
timings are fast and slow,
just trying to
play
find some
faster
other
at
interesting
faster
ones.
speeds and slow one at slower speeds, and all that we're doing for the animation test. We're trying to figure out how much we can push these.
Here's kind of a fun one I made. This shows more of the power of the whole system itself.
Start with the base speed of
And this demonstrates the hierarchical nature.
But the base speed
So
is-
what it does is I've got
Question is,
a particle which makes this particle here called tilt axis, and I don't actually render that particle. I have it at size 0 so that you don't actually see it. I can make it size 1,
it's made for that timing, right?
and then now that you can see it, you can see what it's doing.
So right now,
It
everything
makes
just has the bow attached.
its own
What
axis,
you have is the
and
bow
then
and
that
the
forms
standard
the
tag.
basis
Randomly pick between
of
standard
these
tags,
squircles
because those both have-
that are
all three of
rendering
those have
here.
bow and attack.
And these are just particles which are rendering, and then they're moving in a path. And I have the velocity set up so that they move in this rounded corner fashion, which is colloquially called a squircle. So it's kind of fun stuff you can do with it. And our particle system is actually quite powerful in the way you can move things around. In other systems I've used, basically what you had to do to get things to follow an interesting path like that is you would import a path and then use that or a spline, and then the particles follow that spline, which is very useful, but this way I can define
I'm in the game right now.
live through parameters what I want. So when I want to make a helix, for instance, like here's something I was making recently. I was trying to do a rough pass on how to do like a tightening rope. Since I don't have meshes and everything has to be a particle now, I was trying to figure out a clever way I could simulate that. So
The basic arrow. So,
what it does is it just draws a whole bunch of particles
that doesn't have a siege in it.
on a path like this. And so I can draw a helix like that. And this is again showing you the hierarchy, where I've got this little bit of tilt at the beginning, which makes the rope-ish shape more random, like the ropes, do this as it's wrapping around the subject. And then there's a head, which at the moment I have visible, but doesn't really need to be for a rope. And then the trail behind it here forms the rope itself. And as soon as I put on the sprite, which is actually like a repeating rope sort of piece, when they overlap slightly, it'll give the illusion of being a rope. Close enough for now, anyway.
Why did we make
This is like a quick snare sort of effect. Still needs to have the timing worked out.
We'll actually draw like
Let me.
to show.
I shall put in a nude human so you can see the scale.
I gotta turn that off. Alright, I might have to just jump back in. Because it's drawing it on top of it.
So are we,
No one's
are we
moderating.
going to start making different animations for all the different arrow types?
I'm just checking the chat here to see if anyone
This is just testing.
saying anything.
I'm not doing
So anyway,
a bunch of different new animations for specific arrows.
this demonstrates some of what I've got.
So the CG arrow is the only one that gets...
That one is actually
Right, just for right
a
now.
great example
There's a
of
much bigger discussion about that. This was just getting.
some of the new features that I've been given lately.
Alright, so apparently this is just a one-off that we're doing specifically for this one type of arrow and the other.
One big thing that I wanted to point out is that
Okay.
before,
So if I can start on the server, I'll see.
I've always had this hierarchy over here,
So what I did was I put the
but before it was quite rigid in that
standard tag on the
I could
basic
make
arrow,
new child
tag on the
particles
CG
and
arrow,
spawners,
which
but I couldn't
theoretically
really
just
move
tags
things
you can
around.
across the skill, so if you build a skill, you use the
And
CG arrow.
Bull
And
did
I
some
also
great
put
work.
the
He
CG arrow to the,
implemented a feature that I really wanted, which was the ability to drag items in the tree around kind of dynamically. So let me load up a fancier
Which means that it
one.
won't try to look up the tag because it can't even use that skill.
I will. Let me see.
No,
I have
so
so
if
many
you're- if you
files
have a short bow
here.
equipped, right? The weapon you have equipped
Oh, okay.
puts you in an anim set, right?
Just trying to think of what
So
the
if you have
good
the
one
short bow equipped, you're in the
is.
short bow
So
anim set.
right now
But
we're
when you
working
try to use
on
the skill that uses the siege arrow
getting in a first pass of all the Saturday Night Siege items. So I've been doing some
and has a requirement
initial
that
effects
says
for
you fire a
those.
longbow. So
I
if you
think-
have a
I think I'm
short
gonna
bow
have my
equipped
own
and you try to use the skill,
VFX, but
it
nothing
won't
that shows
work
like that.
because you don't have a
And
longbow.
so I can show you a
And the
fancier
reason for that
one.
is that if it worked for the short bow, it would use the siege tag, which would fail, and it would play some other animation. So in the longbow anim set, it
What I
has
want
that.
is
So what we're
that.
gonna do, there's some tech that technically just do one test is fair.
I
To
want-
actually set it up on
And in the
Well, here's one.
the siege arrow has the siege tag.
There's a
So
prepare phase.
This one is
VFX and sounds. So that
pretty elaborate as far as anything that I've done.
this doesn't account for all
And
the
this is a
VFX.
Shrapnel Burst,
And then it will launch it.
and it's the siege arrow which comes in and then it does
So
kind of like little sub-munitions blast to spread shrapnel around. And so as you can see, the tree for this is
play the other one.
a lot bigger.
I think that was on
Is what it's doing is it's creating pivots and then little blasts. And here's what it looks like. So, like this.
yes, it will
I would
always,
take out-
always.
I would make the
Yeah.
permutation of the flyby, just take out that.
So it creates a central blast and then it creates like
Yeah,
a
because when are those even supposed to be?
like a random cloud around it of other blasts.
So the VFX that this one
Testing the
leaves behind
animations.
is very nice, and so
Are those supposed to play with?
the other one has a very kind of magical look to it.
Yeah.
So it has that
Splat effects for Donnie.
in there, and the crystally splinters.
So this one
I
came
think
out
you
pretty
get
well.
away with just taking
Um,
out
So,
One thing to keep in mind for all the effects that I'm working on now for Saturday Night Siege is that we are purposely making them a bit big and probably a bit over the top just to stress the system and just to see what happens when a whole bunch of these are going off in a battle. So
Last-
all of the stuff that I'm working on now is absolutely subject to change. But anyway, getting back to the thing that I was saying about the
Yeah.
feature Bull
Let's
asked me
switch
for,
places.
is that now I've got a particle like this, this is where the flak blasts are generated, and what it does is it scatters a bunch of random points around you like this, and
For me,
it does
when I
about
fired
it does 20 per second, but it waits 5 frames to start blasting away, and then that scatters points within a radius around me like this. So, for instance, if I decided that let me slow down the time for a moment here. Like this. So if I didn't want the little flashes to appear in the middle of each of the blasts like this, or I wanted to do something to it, I can just I can drag it around. I can change the hierarchy, or I could make the flames that come out of the center of those blasts, and I can just do this, and now it's a child of that.
So what ended up happening when you fired it is I would hear
Alright, so this is
It probably has the same end result here, but
way after it hit.
This is just associating those
what that basically means is that
arrows, which is not ideal.
the
but-
blast happens, and then it creates this thing which is the core, which is just
It's still going, right?
a big glowing ball. And then that ball
Yeah, we just
generates, defines the center point for where the flames and other bits come out of. So I don't know if that'll actually break the effect. This is an effect which is better seen at real-time speed. You can see its particle nature a lot more when you slow it way down, but
Well, I'm not using
can't.
the tag.
I don't want to keep it,
So theoretically, it's going to do
you know,
slow tag, so it shouldn't
too
have to result
fancy
in this test.
because
This is just gonna work out
trying
the
to
difference between
And that one doesn't
slow
keep the
attack
performance
and
at least
slow attack
reasonable.
siege. So slow is the
But the
control.
time
So
scale
it's
is another nice thing that we've added. So I can just move a slider. So now I'm back to real time.
Yeah,
And I can even play it at double time if I wanted.
take the opportunity.
Sometimes it's useful to see how an effect plays even faster than normal, because what I tend to do is I'm more likely to make an effect too slow than too fast, and a lot of these games like MMORPGs need effects which are a lot crisper and faster so they don't linger too much. And so there's kind of a balance between the drama of like a big blast, which you would expect to be slower, and a faster one, which you want to look powerful, but you don't want to linger around too much because you don't want to have everyone wading through a ton of particles all the time. So this effect actually works okay, even faster. It gets a little more of the firecracker kind of
So
thing
this
going
seems to
on.
work. I'm going to go ahead and push that to master, and then it'll take a
But anyway, Bull did a great job
Yeah, Play-Doh.
giving me some extra features in the editor, which really saved me a lot of time. Another neat thing I can do, which is really useful, is
on archers, right?
if I have a useful bit of a particle like this spark spray, which
all that, but like
generates
doesn't really do anything for
these
it.
little,
Which sound?
Animation wise,
the spark spray generates those little lines of red dots, the glowing orange dots. And if I wanted to reuse that for something else, what I can do now is he's got what he calls the bag of holding, which is kind of like a clipboard, but it's a multi-clipboard. So I can do copy, and then I can do deep copy,
some of those
and that copies everything that
Yeah, and it's
all of its children. So it will get spark spray, pivot, radial, and spark. And then if I look over here in my bag of holding, here
Yeah,
it
so
is.
some
Yeah,
of
that
those
sounds
skills
fine.
affect time.
It's not lasting 3 seconds.
And here's another one I saved for some work I was doing earlier.
The Black Knight.
And that will stay for the whole session, so
basic bow,
I can
basic arrow, basic
go
like
back to another effect.
Single timing. So him playing this one animation. all the
like
time.
I will show you.
But for the archers, like if we
I'll try to
wanted
show you some
we
other
could
good ones here.
Tag different skill parts differently depending on the timing of their abilities. So like the faster
Yeah, I don't even care. Like we were hearing earlier, like the last like
Just checking the chat here to see what I'm missing.
It's not happening anymore.
Can they be used as AOE projectiles? Well, yeah, these are sort of
This
AOE.
is the same as
Um,
when we were making these for the great sword. Right?
The way the effect
The purpose of
actually
making these
works in the
swords
game
was
is defined
to
by
do an
Ben.
evaluation against these.
So
we would
he gives me
take these
basic parameters for how an effect should,
that run in different
what its basic
No, I mean,
purpose
play
is,
them on a character in the game,
and
and then compare
like a
that to
description of,
taking
well, this has a
standard
blast and we want it to
standard
be
timing.
have a result which is 10 meters across or 15 meters across, and then I just kind of make something which
so that it plays
will
faster
work with
and
that.
slower. Remember, because we've done that in the past. And then
So,
deciding, like,
That's what was happening.
this is the explosive charge arrow.
to make these animations
Now
it's
slower and faster, or can we just take one animation and stretch it and compress it to make the animation?
And now it-
A lot of the stuff I'm working on now is
Fire-
subject to much further refinement. Like I fully admit that I need to adjust or update some of the sprites that I'm using. I'm kind of reusing things that I already had before, just because our way of updating sprites right now is a little bit
So
hard to
this-
deal with. So
Very fast.
it's easier if I can just modify what I've already used before to get good results. And then I'm going to come back later and swap in some better stuff. For instance, the smoke poofs are okay, but they could be a lot better.
Yeah, I'll gun you. No.
And the explosion poofs. The other thing that I'm looking into is more of a stylistic consideration. And
It was playing the sound on the player as well.
And
on the trail.
our game is not really meant to be super realistic, so I'm thinking that I'm probably going to try to incorporate some elements into it that make it look a little more what I would call painterly. We don't want it to look toonish. I don't want, big poofy toon kind of explosions or exaggerated look like that, but a little more abstract, a little more painterly, a little more interesting, rather than just trying to do everything totally realistic. And I think that'll be much better. But for now, it's kind of they're just kind of generic.
So remote players were seeing
One thing you may have noticed here is that another great feature I got in the particle system is I can do the lit particles. This has been around for a while. You might have seen it in one of our updates. But let me see.
Here's how much the speeds can be affected before we get into territory. This brings the animation, so don't make it any
There are
more.
still a few quirks to work out. Like there's a little weird lighting issues.
So I think we just want to sit down and
I like that one. This stabilized stone.
sit down with you. and
Like when the
That it's got a nice little like tinkle to it.
when the lit particles are in a shadow area like this, they get a weird. They lose their actual color. They're not lit by the world properly, and the alpha doesn't work right. It's just some strange quirk. But you can see that the clouds look a lot more volumetric with the lighting. So, like for instance, I will switch these to unlit.
What I'm honestly expecting.
When they're unlit, that means they're totally not affected by
I'm going to be learning a lot.
the light in the world or light generated elsewhere. So
I feel like if we put something more like breaking glass in there, I mean, it's not literally, but like a high-pitched kind of.
there's some kind of background stuff going on too, which isn't causing my frame rate to be a little choppy. I don't think OBS helps me much
Or maybe
either.
just bring it up then.
Anyway, so as you can see now, these puffs
It doesn't do any of
are
just
barely a little bit, tiny bit blue-gray.
So the changes I was
That's the way I've set it up here.
It's pretty
So
good.
they're at like 0.5, 0.5, 0.55. So they're just a touch blue-gray, and the particle itself is kind of a neutral gray color. And then as soon as I turn on the light,
No, I know.
I put it in the lit mode here, like this.
I can go through and
Go from
talk about
unlit.
all the special arrows.
I can actually do simple lit. I'll show you that too. The simple lit is a little bit fancier than unlit, but what it does is it just takes into account the basic direction of the light, and it's monochromatic, so the light that goes across is sprite is entirely grayscale. Like it doesn't use the colored lights at all. But it's useful for giving the illusion of a particle which is lit a bit, but
Is what's kind of
What
missing.
animation do we need?
doesn't need the normal map.
Because I just
Yeah, it
So
sounds
a good
like
example would be, say, smoke that's right near a torch where you want the light, the smoke that's coming from the torch to look a little more interesting than it normally would
explosion versus
as unlit, where it would be totally glowing all the time. But you might not want it to be as expensive as the lit ones, which are like this.
Let me. I've got the words in my head, but let me see if I can find you an example.
Takes a moment to
of
update
what I'm
there.
thinking
So
about.
now we're back to the
Give me
lit
some feedback
ones.
on it.
Well, it won't yet.
Is the splintering?
Another thing I need to work on
Yeah, it
is
just
my
needs to be
technique for
shortened.
generating the normal maps for these, because it's a bit tricky. Especially near the edges. And the way I was doing it before kind of flattened them out in an unfortunate way. And here it's not so noticeable because I've got a big field of it like this, so it doesn't look quite as bad as it does in other situations. But for instance, so
Who's the movie The Winter Huntsman?
here's my first pass at an acid splash,
Huntsman.
which does use the
A lot of ice.
lit particles. But
Because I was just running.
when they're alone in a little poofy explosion like this, they look a lot
The
flatter.
next time after he does.
And that's because I just need to work on making sure the dynamic range in the normal maps is great enough so that you get the full directionality from them. And when I blurred them out so that they would be less noisy, I kind of flattened them out a bit too much. But this is really the first time I've ever dealt with particles which have normal maps, so it's kind of a learning process and figuring everything out. And this effect is at least workmanly. It's good enough for right now. I need some better nuance in the middle. The splashy bit in the middle is kind of weak. But and again, here's another one that's
Well, I mean,
got a
the Shrapnel
hierarchy.
already fixed standard because
It shows you how that whole system really
it's
works.
when you're using other
So what
arrows,
happens
like,
is
not siege arrow, but
that will
the
make some of
archer
these
specific ones,
zero,
like the
so you can-
black guard has like black arrow.
by making them zero
arrows.
size, that will essentially eliminate them.
To the VFX, right?
Yeah,
So-
they're just gonna have like archery attack or whatever. The standard
It's
or the basic
it sort of mimics the way a real splash
So
works.
Oh, sorry, but not the
Like
siege.
the-
standard instead.
Sorry, I was thinking of everything else.
you initially get this kind of high-speed jet of stuff happening in the middle. Again, we need to work on this whole timing. It's not really quite right. And then the jet creates little splashes, which I call dissolve, like this. Those kind of break up into individual splashes of water.
Yeah, I don't know what yet.
And then those splashes evaporate, or don't evaporate, they dissolve themselves or turn into a mist afterward, like that. So if you put all three together, you kind of get what you're looking for. Anyway,
Wait, do it again.
pretty good for now. It's also totally random. One of the things you're not seeing is that when these effects are close to the ground, you don't see the underside of it, because
Yeah, are we just?
I generate them, or I
Which
one are you firing?
have to make them at 0. Sometimes when I'm creating them, I have them spawn above the ground so I can see the whole thing. The mist puffs here also generate a great feature that I have not had before, which is very common in video games, which is soft particles. And that does some trickery with the Z buffer so that particles which are intersecting surfaces like this do a bit of a depth test, and then they don't clip directly into it. So for instance, if I turn soft particles off on these and then I do it, you will see
Not that I have any problem with it, it's just
you can see the hard edges happening right here as it clips through the surface. And this is really useful for any kind of explosion or gaseous effect which is happening against the surface. So when this splats against a wall, it'll look nicer. It won't,
That one sounds awesome.
won't look so ugly.
Yeah, and we have 3 of them.
Yes, it is a very stinky spell. It's called acidic concoction. Thank goodness games don't have smell-o-vision, right?
How do I test that?
And
We have 1 license for that, and that license can only be installed on 1 machine.
let me see.
So we have to figure out the last place we used it, deregister it from there, and then
Another thing I've been working on is trails. Andrew, a couple months back, did some serious work on the way we have velocity-aligned particles,
Yeah,
and
I love the close-up.
that yielded some really useful stuff.
Aesthetic stuff.
It was first put in because we wanted to
Right.
have better trails on weapons,
Alright.
and we don't have ribbons yet, but we can generate a sequence of particles in a line, which is kind of like what I showed you with the rope. And that's a good enough simulation of it for right now. Eventually we will have ribbons. That's just a future feature list kind of thing. But
Am I hearing liquid?
what
when you
it does
fire?
now is when I create it,
Okay.
or I want to create a trail,
Go again.
I can set the local coordinate space of a particle system to follow the velocity. And so as it's moving its local axis, whichever one I define, X, Y, or Z, becomes the direction of the velocity. And that allows me to do the trails like this. So this is just a test that I made
You stand next to me.
So that's the one that we probably should be playing. And the other ones aren't supposed
like
to
a
be
flare
playing.
effect.
So like, should we play them at all? If we
You
don't
see how
have
that kind of like
specific
the liquidy part goes
longer
away
and
pretty
shorter
quick.
abilities to play them on? Yeah, so I can
And
just basically set that up for now.
look at it in slow motion.
It's minor.
What we're doing whenever we do our animation
Yeah.
test review with all those skills.
one really nice feature or
Yeah,
addition
of course,
that
at some point.
Right.
what Andrew's new code added
Because all
was
those skills are created, all the animations are
now
created.
I can define
Yeah,
generation of particles not only in terms of time spawns per second,
Maybe
but I
it just needs to
can
linger a
do it
little
per
longer.
meter, which is extremely useful because that means no matter how fast the particle is moving when it's leaving a trail behind it, I can space them out precisely, and
Yeah, but whenever we're
that
gonna do
is
that,
crucial for doing any kind of
yeah, Sharpo has different colors.
smooth-looking trails.
Probably just
There are
different
still a
character, I
few
guess.
little quirks when particles render at the beginning on trails. So what I've been doing lately is,
Yeah, one of them fits, 2 of them do not.
like for instance here,
Which is why we
I have the
this.
glow,
Yeah,
which is this glowing
Alright, that will be fine, I guess.
flare bit at the beginning, and then the trail here
No, I mean that works just fine.
generates
Until then, I'll just
particles per meter at 0, and then it waits for frame 8, and then it begins to generate them at 3 particles per meter afterwards. And that prevents the little glitchy thing which happens. Or that bug is going to be fixed. And anyway, normally what you want for any of the archery abilities or things which are going to be leaving a trail behind them is you want to delay that generation anyway, because you don't want the trail kind of in your face immediately as you launch the arrow or
Are you seeing any kind of an impact?
the siege weapon or whatever it is. So having the delay in there is necessary anyway. So that's kind of fun.
Corrosive.
And I made a more obnoxious one here where... oh yeah, I might have turned...
You mean, say that again?
Yeah. So this one, when I put in my calibration texture, one of them, my arrow, you can really see how they're perfectly evenly spaced.
Oh, look at that nice little lag bug. Has he fired on your end yet? Yeah, he's stuck. What is going on?
I actually have a whole bunch of these. I turned off some of them. I was reporting a little problem, so...
He's just stuck.
For my example, I turned some of them off. But
Server go fun.
there.
Yeah,
So.
stuck in animation. Can you do anything? Are you there? Can you shoot him? Okay.
So we'll have
You're back
anime
to-
mecha rocket attack, right?
Well, since it's just suddenly happened, I guess the server is really important.
The flamey one is one I'm using for one of the other siege things, or a variant of it. Need some better textures on those, but
Yeah, failed
yeah, it could be a
server.
magic mortar. Who knows?
So corrosive impact. I wonder if that had anything to do with the servers then.
Let me see. Oh yeah, I can show you. This one's kind of fun. This is supposed to be an implosion. Not quite what I want yet, but it's pretty good. Fortunately, I have it tilted upward because the implosion is supposed to line up with the way the arrow comes in. This is for a siege arrow.
No, I'm talking to Andrew.
So it's aligned with X, which is this way, so that when the arrow strikes a surface, that the blast goes out like this and should theoretically be perpendicular to the way the arrow hits. But what I can do is I have this node up here, which is called face minus X, and that's at minus 90 on the phi axis, and so as soon as it updates, anyway, so now it's rotated back, so you can kind of see what it looks like. I'm pretty happy with that. Again, the gray poofs at the end need work, but my breakthrough on this one to make it look better was this. Let me show you. So, as I mentioned earlier, everything in our game has to be sprites, and I can't animate material. So,
Yeah, no problem.
what I do is I generally have two sets of sprites, and I have them rendered together, or one set of sprites leave another object as, or another sprite as a child object, and then I massage them so that they blend together in an interesting way. So when you look at this explosion, Make sure. Well, that's actually not so bad without that one either. What I did was I removed some of the contrasting elements.
No problem, I can't get anyway. Could you?
Here, I'll do it on this one.
Yeah, no problem.
And then when you put in
Chat real quick, one blue thing I was saying I needed to tell you.
this extra thing, which is called Flash's Contrast, it adds a little bit more of the dark poof back into it, and then that gives it the kind of the broiling gasoline thing. The whole effect is so fast anyway that you don't really get to see a whole lot of it. But ideally, what I would like is I would like the gas part of it to really broil or to look a little more 3D, and that would require a better. I would need to re-render some of the sprites to play a better sequence, and I kind of cheat here. And when I just have this one particle called Puff 3, which is kind of a generic puffy blob, and I use that as the bright bit. But if I were to make a fancier version of this puff and then have it be a whole sequence, it would probably look much more interesting. But anyway, it's not bad. Let's see. Actually had fun experimenting with all the new features, so I can do some really interesting stuff now, like I think this one is pretty basic. So here's your generic. Let me get rid of Arthurian dude. So, you know, your generic kind of spiky ball of anime magic. And I can turn on I think I put some little rainbowy bits in there, yeah. Not sure I'll really use this for anything, but it's fun. Just having those directional capabilities just help me so much. I can really do a lot that I couldn't do at all before. It would have been totally impossible. So and as you can see, I can get a whole lot of mileage out of a whole simple set of sprites. So I can reuse the same sprites in different ways. And even though they're the same images, you wouldn't know it unless you looked at it. Oops, no.
Yeah, we're running under a profiler, so it's probably going to take a bit for folks to connect.
These jets are playing continuously now, but they could be used for something like an effect which just kind of flashes underneath you, or for a teleport, or who knows, or they could be used for some sort of jet. I just made them for fun. I saw a jet from a video game, and I was wondering how I could actually do the same thing with our engine. Fiddling around. I kind of like these subtle effects like this. was trying to think of other ways we could have like auras or something that you place on the ground where this is going to be like a healing region or a buff region or something like that. So something like this might work. I made a couple variants. I should probably put them all in the same scene. Anyway, so some different colors. What's kind of nifty here is the fact that this dome shape is entirely a sprite. I think I turned on soft particle. Yes, I did. And what it is it's actually using the lit particle, and it's just got a spherical normal map on it, so it kind of looks a bit like it's a dome. And then the soft particle, because of the way it intersects with the ground, gives the illusion that it's 3D, but it's completely a card. Oh yeah, one other thing that I probably didn't show before is the fact that our particles to some extent use the Pbr system. I don't really use it a whole lot, but I have used it occasionally for some particles. And so I can control the roughness and the spec mask, which dictate some of the rendering properties of the shininess and the roughness of a material. And so let's see if this does anything. So if I set this roughness down to 0.2, yeah. So you can see that the highlight that's on this fake sphere that I have in here is a lot sharper now. So it can kind of look like glass or a shiny surface. I think the dome image itself now is just a flat disk of color which fades out at the edges, so it doesn't really try to look like glass or anything in particular. It's just meant to be a soft edge disc, which I apply material settings to. And you can make it whatever color. So it's more yellowy. More purple. Slightly purple. Since it is a lit particle, it's being illuminated by our sun object in the world here. Still kind of tweaking our whole daylight settings and how that whole interaction works. The way the effects look in the editor is slightly different than the way they look in the game, so I'm getting used to that. Hopefully that'll be evened out a bit. Oh, here's a fancier one I made. This one does the same dome thing, but I have it spitting out particles toward the middle, which creates this kind of wiggly. It's vaguely creepy and pretty at the same time. I don't know what I would use it for, but it was fun. By adjusting the parameters for how much velocity inheritance these little blobs get, you can make them more or less wavy. So, for instance, now they start off very stiff here at the beginning, and then they get much less at the end, and that allows the end to do a little bit of this. So I start them off less, and then I go down to 0.2 at the end. Yeah, you can see that they flex a bit more. I also can move these around a little bit. So what they do now is they all generate up here at the top, and then they quickly scatter over the surface, and then after that I have them loop, and then they just kind of do this random motion, and they just randomly go around the theta axis and the phi axis, and that makes them do strange things. And I have these set to lit right now as well, as you can see. Or actually these blobs might be simple lit. No, they're lit. So on the sun side like this, I might have put a light in the middle. Yeah, I did. So I put a purple light in the center here as well, so at nighttime it looks interesting. That's kind of fun. Yeah, I could be absorbing blood from enemies. The other one. That's kind of what I was thinking. It looks like a bit like it's definitely like a bunch of syringes. Here's one that's totally different. This one is for portal we're gonna put in. For the Viking version. I think this is showing up. Oh, right. Actually, I don't know if I have one which doesn't already have an effect on it already, but so anyway, the idea is that this ring here is where you pass into to go through the teleporter, and then the other runes kind of hang in the air. Let me see if I can find. Show you Michelle's concept of it. And then let's see what this looks like at nighttime. Probably looks better. Yeah. But the ring here uses a lot of the same principles as the dome does. It creates a particle out here at a radius, and then that generates more interesting stuff which is going inward. This one just happens to be on a disk rather than a dome. I was actually gonna, as part of the stream, work on some stuff, but running out of time here. I'm working on the Blackguard. he's kind of got a basic pass of archery stuff right now, and so I'm hoping to use some of what I've learned making the siege arrows to come back to what he's got, because the Blackguard has some similar effects. For instance, he's got like an arrow which is an explosive arrow. He's also got an arrow which catches things on fire, and we've got similar things with siege arrows, and so his abilities will probably be similar but smaller. And I'm trying to add a little bit of flair to him as well, to like give him his own distinct kind of fire look. It's another thing we'll probably need to fully flesh out with some other concepts and things like that, but the whole idea of having the same element on a couple different realms be slightly different, just so you can tell them apart, or enough different that you can kind of tell what Viking fire looks like as opposed to Arthurian fire. This would be per class, specifically to the Blackguard, but it might end up making Arthurian fire look more that way in general. I don't know. I haven't put a whole lot of thought into it yet, but as I learn all these new techniques,
Do you have a sec since I've got the bed? Look at the boat.
it'll be a lot easier. So I'll look at some of the other blasts I've done.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff, this one's kind of similar to what you saw before. Oops, I don't need the portal anymore. So a lot of this kind of stuff. Big explosion, how do I make it look more interesting?
You want the stairs generally to be wide enough that, like, well, not. It's almost like
I make a lot of
2.5, like, the arms
variants.
out.
Over time they just got fancier, where I would experiment with the splash in the middle generating other things in the same way that I did with Acid Blast. The same principle, where you have jets of gas, and then those generate a poof themselves, and then you have these other things like these sparks
From the
and
concept,
bits,
those things, like, you see people standing in a, like, castle.
Yeah,
like,
they would see over the kernels.
like this.
Yeah. So the idea is that you can see the. What's the concept for that? Yeah. So
The
you may just want to make
Blackguard
these
effect that I was working on is supposed to be, I think, 5 meters across.
You know, if you're gonna shoot from it,
I'm
you have
hoping
to-
it's just across and not radius, because
The
the bigger an explosion gets, the harder it gets to do, so that it looks right.
Combat right now, there's no reason you probably want to make sure that
It's one of the tricky bits about doing things for MMOs which go over a large area, is making an effect which gets the idea across that yes, this thing blasted, and that everyone within
and have
a 10 meter or 15 meter radius is going to be affected by it, without actually making an effect which fills up that whole volume, because things in MMOs generally are, everyone in this sphere is affected by this, and so you need to get the idea across that yes, you were hit by it, but you don't want an effect that's that large, because it's a huge effect, and everyone's screen will be bogged down with particles, and it won't look very good, and it'll be very
Wouldn't the easier thing be just raise on the floor?
detrimental to performance.
Take your floor and
So, like here's
You need to be able to get up the stairs
a
at
more
45 degrees.
gasoline type explosion it's fiddling with. And I did this one, the little radial things coming off of it were kind of ugly,
Yeah, then I would
but
see.
Again, work in progress. I tend to do everything about 50 times before I'm happy with it, so
Right now it's for the
our goal here now is to just
Hey, now let's build the interior
get
of the ship.
first pass looking good enough to test things, like I said, and
Proper fair, or we
This
use
is
this
this is a prop right.
refine from
We're
there.
going to use it when it's just for
So I have to
This is a prop.
kind of
You're gonna be like, hey, remember that
curtail
thing
my
in the
instinct to be a
where your
perfectionist.
players can go inside and store things inside of it. And, like,
So,
we're gonna have
it's
to do
a
whole
little
lot
better,
of
it's a little more
exterior to
poofy.
make it work for a future interior.
This is another one that would be benefited by having a better sprite or series of sprites. I kind of cheesed this one where I used the same sprite twice. And I used the same trick I was talking about before where I blend two things together so that they look interesting.
Goes back and forth on itself.
In this case, what I call flashes, which is this puff 2. And I started off with really super orange like this, but I only leave it bright for a few frames and then it goes straight to gray. And then puffs, which are also puff 2, which kind of overlap it and blend with it, and then it kind of gives you the illusion of that gas explosion.
You go inside.
And like in a ladder.
Yeah.
I'm just
they
checking
come out
the
and
chat
go-
here.
Like this one does have it on that side, but some will just like be like a big square.
They're basically just you get up in there and shoot from them. I was assuming this was like a warship.
So if that's easier to get the height or
Yeah,
whatever.
I do the same thing. I've
What he's saying is if you split
I sometimes
this
see something
stair
really
in half,
neat
you
on
can
a video that
do it
I'm
as a-
studying. Someone came up with a really great solution for a particle effect or something, and
Like,
I
the
just
reason for that is that this
want
video-
to click on it and drag it and slow it down and look at it. But it's just a video.
In a video game, you do because
So I just have to play it
humans
back
can walk
over and
up very
over.
steep stairs. Video game characters
Yeah.
don't do
But yeah,
steep stairs.
Do you think they're really thick, those walls?
I agree with you, Vessier, about the VFX artists. I've gone towards, I want everyone to feel super powerful. Yeah, that is true.
Once you make them
Um,
deeper and wider, you're gonna have
I've
less of them because you want enough
Spent
space
most
in
of
there
my
to stand in it.
time working on
To his waist
MMORPGs. I
that
did
if
start
you do all
off
this,
early on at Mythic with
all of this needs to be clear,
smaller
so I
games
can do this and
or
then
multiplayer
slide
games where there are fewer people, so didn't have to worry as much about effects. But
Yeah, so what you may want to do is just kind of
in the bigger games where you can't control what everyone's doing and there can potentially be a lot of people, the whole effect scaling issue becomes very important.
You can take all this
So
red stuff from the console.
that is again one of the things we're really concentrating on in our Saturday Night Siege testing.
And then it would be gray as well.
Just how many people are together, what happens when a whole bunch of these effects are going off in a small area, how big do they really need to be to get their purpose across to the player. All that stuff is very important feedback. One of my goals originally when we started working on this game was to try to figure out how to make some of the effects more subtle, and I hope to be able to do that so that they're still subtle and attractive, but don't disappear completely, and it's a tricky balance. So what you're seeing now again is just
Find yourself making a thing and you don't know what it is. Try and figure out what it is by
experimentation
doing
to some
research.
extent. And then as I figure out the tools better and refine my technique, I'll be able to crank out this stuff a lot faster. But there's a lot to learn.
Ships are super complicated.
Let me see if I have anything else.
Also, where did you get whatever reference you used for this? Is that part of? Yeah, it looks like a ship I dropped.
The whole, everything is a particle in our VFX system now has been a little bit tricky for me to get by. So I've had to learn a whole lot of new ways of thinking about things. Systems I've used before, you'd be surprised. They do have particles, and a lot of things I did use particles, but a lot of effects, even in games now, are not individual particles. They're a lot of times meshes which are animated in interesting ways, or there are meshes which are used as particles in certain ways. Speaking of which, let me see.
open up the reference for you guys? Or did I only send it to Michelle?
Probably saw the cube thing when we first came out with the normal particles. I'll show you this one again. This is a better example than the cloud. But so here, I think I set this to lit. Yeah. So this is actually a particle. It's just a card with a normal map on it. And admittedly, it doesn't have a whole lot of frames. I think I only gave it, I only made 16 frames for the whole rotation. But it demonstrates that you can kind of fake it. Since this particular thing would probably be in a big scatter of rocks or something like that, you wouldn't be able to notice as much that it was camera facing. You can see now, I mean, it looks 3D, although you're always seeing the rock rotate the same way. You don't see the rock change its rotation as you move the camera around it. But in a big scatter of things, it doesn't matter. So let's see.
We're looking at like late period for this specifically because we're trying to differentiate our variants from the other realms.
Let me see.
Yeah, build this thing and put this into the board in there too, and probably stay along.
This one has some kind of white snowy bits, I think. They're not the greatest yet, but it demonstrates the principle.
So just make one of them. Right.
The little snowy chunks are all
Because otherwise, what would
totally
happen is
flat
all these
cards,
things do this, right?
but they're so fast
Just because you've modeled that without doing it.
you don't really see
This
it.
is one of the fun parts about the boat. Like, once we get all the basics down, we can do some like fun little nice touches with the rigging and little details that'll make the bigger shapes look good against them. This is where you're getting into the
When I think about an effect, I tend to think in very 3D volumetric terms, so
more things.
I'm constantly trying to figure out how to arrange a cluster of particles so that it looks like the volume I'm envisioning without using too many particles. My only weapon right now, as I like to say, is for an effect is more particles, and that's not really where I want to get to. I want to get to the point where I have maybe a few more options up my sleeve so I can make things look interesting without just adding more particles to make it blend in a more interesting way or look more convincing. Ideally, what I would like to do is have a little bit of material animation so I could maybe do some UV scrolling or some blending. You know, they do a lot of cool things in games like Final Fantasy where they have like a mesh wave that comes out and there's the material on it is animated so that it's got a lot of interesting like sub detail happening in it, like parts of it are melting away and then appearing,
Yeah, you're on the right track here.
and it's all done through an animated material and not through more particles. The good news is that the more particles way now anyway is probably a bit cheaper than that, so
Yeah, those metal braces on and stuff.
our system is able to handle a fairly substantial number of particles, and it's still being optimized too, by the way. But the way we're doing things now is very efficient, and which is what we want, because one of our core ideas, the core goals of our game is to allow the big battles and have a lot of people on the screen at one time doing interesting things, so
But I don't know if I want to create one.
In the high poly, add some more.
the better performance we can get.
Yeah. I probably just like keeping it in 1, 2, 3 space.
I'll go back to this blend one. Oops. Occasionally I click something on an editor too fast and a weird assert comes up.
Maybe one's missing here and there.
So, thing I wanted to mention before getting back to this one that I showed you originally is
Where's the? You haven't done it yet. Okay.
One of the performance things that we put in our game
Sometimes it says big paddle sticking out.
is
Use like that. I mean, like,
a renderer uses order independent transparency. And basically what that means is that things like particles, which can be very dense on the screen, do not have to be sorted before they're rendered.
You know what I mean? There's no
They can all just be
I
slapped into a buffer, and then the shader works out what thing should appear in front of what
Anybody who knows what load is.
based on math. And it can do it all in one pass, which makes it very fast. However, that does cause some interesting interaction, and right here I can show you.
Again, this is a later period.
So what I've got here, as you can see, is I've got this
Yeah, that's
orange ball and a blue ball right next to it. And you can see how as they overlap like this, I kind of get this strange interaction. And so if you see this in the game, that's what that is. In some cases it can be kind of attractive, like it can produce some interesting results. For instance, let me see.
Yeah.
Well,
And make sure that the rigging is all set for it, so that there's ropes going back and winding around, so as you're turning it, you can see.
Here's
that, like,
another one of
oh,
these
that's
kind
another
of
rope, and that rope is pulled
spherical
from
aura
here,
things
so
I
when you
made.
turn this like 50 times, it turns by this many degrees.
find what you need to do is.
Yeah, I need to go.
And due to the way these blobs in here interact with
Specifically called out.
this other cloud of particles, it kind of creates an interesting dark light cutout kind of look. So I'm keeping this. I don't know what I'm using it for yet, but it's got to be good for something. And let me see.
Yeah, 'cause that's, I mean, these ships are, this is our.
I had another.
So, like, the war thing doesn't make sense. Doing the rudder makes more sense for the side of the ship. Anyway, so I would suggest doing the wheel thing. So what you need to do is just build out a wheel, so that it looks like a mechanical works, and we can stick it right here, because then you can hide all the shit underneath it.
Editor's low. Oh yeah, okay. So this definitely shows you what happens with the alpha on the edges, but it's kind of interesting.
Because there's a rope. It's
The
literally
poofs are just those cloud poofs you've seen before and all the other explosions.
Back and forth, right? To wag my tail and turn them.
But when they
So when you do
interact
this,
with
it pulls the
this
rope
core, which is
around
just
the
a
winch,
big sprite,
yanks it to the other side.
camera facing sprite with little light beams coming out of it, kind of get an interesting look.
We just need
Well,
the
it's
wheel.
just like how you've got all the rigging for the sails. Like, there should be all the rigging for this, even
So
if
I'm not really sure what I'll use it for, but
Yeah.
something to be exploited.
Yeah, just find her.
Oh yeah, what's the last thing I was going to show? Oh yeah.
Can't think about these ships like cars today.
Because then you have to imagine there'd be, 100 feet of rope, big thick rope
But
under
it's
there.
kind of like in Paris Caribbean, you see the like one guy steering in the car, it came, he's like next to him, he's like overseeing all his crew.
This is kind of fun. I was thinking about ways I could make those explosions look better, and this might be the key.
Steering system.
Okay, if you find something beyond that.
One thing I can do with particles, which is quite interesting, is that I can overdrive a lot of the
So
values.
you don't fall off.
So, for instance,
Yeah, a little ledge, a little railing, give me anything.
these blobs here are
Put a railing here with a post or something.
basically just the same as what I use for some of my glows, but when I overdrive the opacity like this,
What I'm saying.
they become these kind of solid metaball shapes when they interact with each other. And this metaball look is kind of the reason it does that is because of the order independent transparency, the OIT. So this is another kind of interesting side benefit. If I turn the opacity back down to 1,
We already made one for somewhere in the game, just something that fits so it doesn't.
you can see they're a lot. This is the way the texture naturally
The other
looks.
thing we could also do is,
Later London, you know what I mean? Like,
so that your period doesn't get too.
yeah.
You could also
Could probably even do some interesting stuff with
brazier in the center or something.
this. So
Well, not fire pit, a brazier.
Yeah.
That's still the Arthurian, that metal
Can
iron brazier with flames
animate
inside
them.
and lamps in other smaller places. Because it's kind of a mix. We're between.
so you can have a solid shape like that, and you can animate it over time.
I'm good. Keep going. We want to. We'll probably want to take a look at what you're doing here.
And it might create an interesting kind of blur out effect. Hadn't really thought of that before. Glad I did now.
Right, but all these ropes probably need to be thinner.
Well, that's not exactly what I wanted.
The ones around the let's
Anyway.
scale up maybe the Viking one.
Yeah, no, the Viking one was so small, so I decided to make it.
Yeah, make them smaller. They
I guess it has to go to 0 for that to actually work.
One of us around. Let's do all this first, and then we'll come back at it.
So
But the,
it
general size
the whole thing is looping, so that's why it creates that weird kind of pulse. But
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we'll just.
Because that'll be harder later.
I think doing the switchback on the stairs is the thing we should do.
Yeah, so I was.
Just because it'll give us more dead space.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, what you'll do is you can put the stairs, to the side here and build a landing. Does that make sense? And
So anyway,
Yeah, but, landing. Yeah, stairwell.
I think being able to adjust the normal maps and the textures on some of my other
Does that make sense?
smoke proofs,
So,
so that I get a more exaggerated spherical
drop it out if you want me to look at it real quick.
thing going on, and it
You'll
will
just
allow me
build
to
out
blend them
the-
together into a more convincing big
Post it.
cloud
And then like
of gas.
She's already got those little lanyards right there on the next level.
Yeah, it's all connected and then just put them around
Is that a new lantern?
No?
Okay.
Yes, the cotton candy mage.
That looks a little like
TBD, no. But, they'll probably
The
work
Candyman,
better
sir.
with the grid, if that's what that is. To look more realistic, or like more.
the iron framework, the little lines is what you're talking about.
But do you want to just?
A few minutes left. I was just thinking if there's anything else interesting to show. Then after lunch, I
Well, I know there's
will
nothing there yet, but we can
actually have to get
Yeah,
back to
start
doing
running
real
these,
work.
Run them the whole way, same spacing. Okay, so the idea here was.
Good news is you didn't have to listen to any kind of pre-canned music. You could only listen to
Oh, no,
the,
there's a stairwell.
the dulcet tones of my voice.
Okay, no, yeah, okay, that's fine, that's fine. Yeah, anywhere you start a pattern, continue it.
I'd suggest to put a shed under there since the stairs are so advanced.
Mm-hmm, gotcha.
Now, what? I actually have the idea to build the shed up there. Now we're gonna have a.
Yeah.
Yeah, alright, okay, cool. I'm gonna start on the stairs.
I've got so much test stuff here, it's hard to find anything anymore.
On this, or do you just write them
Well,
all?
I wrote it down. You know, I see the bell there, another, if you don't like the brazier, another one is to make a big bell.
Anyway,
Well, actually, I like
here's
the
another
brazier.
variant of that
Center
other
of the ship, it would light the ship. I think it's the range.
ray thing, but this time green.
Plus soldiers sitting around.
One thing that really punches up effects, if they're supposed to look bright like this, and this has only dawned on me fairly recently, like within the past year or so, is that the key to having something look really good when it's supposed to be bright like this is to have other objects near it which are darker, because that really adds a lot more interest, and it really sells the whole idea that this thing is luminous. So by having these little blobs that are flowing away from it start out much darker, makes the whole effect look a lot more interesting. You'll see the same thing in movies, like any kind of
When we established that nighttime was so dark.
jet or fire that's coming from something like a spaceship will generally always have some really interesting dark elements mixed in with it, and it makes the whole thing look a lot more dimensional. Doesn't make it look more realistic, because real jets coming out of the back of some jet planes are kind of dull, but
Permanently at this point.
same principle. And the same thing I was showing with the big explosions, although my explosions should be a lot more exaggerated as far as that contrast. But when you have the bright flame and then you have the dark flame overlapping it, and it creates this kind of interesting mix. And it sells a lot better.
Hey, Ben. Actually, while you're over here in mode brain mode.
Oh, it's 1 o'clock.
Just like, so they're
Lunchtime.
not finished at all, but like.
All right.
making
Well, thanks
progress
everyone for
on,
watching.
TD. Am I going to like
Tolerated listening to me for an hour and a half. I'll hopefully be able to do it again sometime, or
Lunch!
actually show you real stuff.
Two tails in the back, you know, like
Or at least
two
new
things,
stuff that
I'm
like,
working
you know,
on.
with the middle.
I like that.
Thanks
way better
again.
than-
Gonna look like kind of like Waterworld. Sometimes they do like, you know, the double flotation on the bottom. But I was thinking that. But